A millionaire found out he had only 1 month left to live. But a chance encounter with a girl changed everything. The waiting room on the 34th floor of Manhattan's Cromwell Medical Center was designed to look calming. Soft beige walls, eucalyptus-scented air, and minimalist chairs that cost more than most used cars. But to Jonathan Miles, it was suffocating. He adjusted the cuff of his custom navy blazer, more out of habit than nerves. His phone was buzzing in his pocket, probably another board member forwarding stock alerts or merger rumors. He ignored it. For once, business could wait. Dr. Lenehan stepped in, clipboard in hand and an expression that said more than words could. Jonathan rose. "In my office," she said gently. It took less than 3 minutes. Pancreatic cancer? Inoperable. For weeks, maybe 5. He didn't ask about treatment. He didn't rage or cry. He just nodded once. His mind, ever efficient, was already sorting the next steps. His estate was in order. His assets, diversified and immense, would quietly fund foundations, scholarships, and shelters. He designed his legacy like a blueprint. But there was a problem. He didn't know how to live. Not without strategy. Not without purpose measured in quarterly gains. Outside the hospital, the spring air felt unfamiliar. His driver, Malik, opened the car door silently, but Jonathan waved him off. "I'll walk." He walked for hours. Past tourists in Central Park. Past street vendors on Fifth Avenue. Through memories he hadn't visited in decades. Cheap beer in dorm rooms, long-forgotten laughter with friends before ambition devoured them all. The sharp suits, the tailored world, the private jet hangars, none of it answered the one question hammering through him now. What is a good day when time is running out? That night, alone in his penthouse, Jonathan opened a bottle of wine from a collection he had never touched. 1982 Chateau Latour. He poured a glass, took a sip, then set it down. He stared out at the city and whispered to no one. "I don't want to die like this. Not without knowing what joy feels like." The next morning, he cancelled all meetings. He instructed his assistant to donate his May salary, an obscene 6 figures, to a free arts school in the Bronx. He called his ex-wife, Amanda, and apologized for the years he couldn't take back. He even called his college roommate, Simon, who now taught poetry at a community college in Vermont. They talked for 2 hours. But none of it felt like life. It felt like penance. Then, one quiet Tuesday afternoon, he met her. She was sitting on the steps of the Astor Library, sketching in a worn notebook with earbuds in, lost in whatever world played behind her glasses. She wore a faded green jacket that swallowed her frame, and a backpack sat beside her, spilling charcoal pencils and a half-eaten apple. He stopped, not knowing why. "Is that supposed to be me?" he asked, nodding toward her sketchbook. She looked up, eyes wide, surprised but not flustered. "Not anymore," she said with a smirk. Jonathan laughed, a real laugh, the kind he hadn't felt in years. Her name was Eliza. 27. A barista in the East Village by day, an illustrator by night, and someone who didn't recognize him at all, which, for once, felt like a blessing. They talked. About everything. About nothing. She was curious, blunt, and oddly disarming. She asked questions no one ever dared to ask him. "Do you ever get bored being rich? What's something you've failed at? Do you even like who you are?" He found himself wanting to answer. They met again the next day. And the next. A walk through the Met. A coffee at a grimy corner cafe. An hour in the park where she drew pigeons and told him their life stories. She didn't ask about his money or his name. She didn't know. He didn't tell her. Something about her made the countdown on his life feel quieter. And that terrified him more than the diagnosis. Jonathan Miles hadn't told her he was dying. In a city that thrived on reinvention, his silence felt less like a lie and more like a permission slip, to be someone else, if only for a while. With Eliza, he wasn't a billionaire or a power broker. He was just Jonathan. A man who walked too slowly, listened too intently, and laughed at the wrong parts of her stories. It had been 6 days since the diagnosis. He had crossed off legacy planning and personal apology tour from his mental to-do list. But the idea of joy still lingered like a problem left unsolved. That morning, he found himself waiting outside Eliza's building in the East Village. It was an old pre-war walk-up with a rusted fire escape and windows that let in too much cold. She lived on the 3rd floor. No elevator. Of course. He texted her half an hour earlier. Jonathan. Coffee? My treat. Eliza. You realize I make coffee for a living, right? Jonathan. Then let me take you somewhere you won't have to pretend to care about oat milk. She appeared in the doorway wearing a scarf with paint stains and boots she probably hadn't cleaned since last fall. You're early, she said, tightening the scarf. I'm dying, he said automatically. She laughed. What, like inside? Join the club. He smiled, but something caught in his throat. A truth too big to name. They walked to a tiny cafe near the Bowery, one of those places where the espresso machine sounded like a dying spaceship and the music was always 20 years behind the times. Eliza ordered black coffee. Jonathan asked for tea. His stomach couldn't handle much else anymore. So, she said, stirring the sugar she didn't need, what do you actually do? You never say. He hesitated, then gave a half-truth. Finance. I used to run a firm. Used to? He shrugged. Let's just say I took early retirement. She raised an eyebrow, unconvinced, but didn't push. They talked for hours. About art, and how she wanted to publish a graphic novel one day. About her late mother, who had taught her to sketch birds and distrust bankers. About her little brother in Boston who she barely spoke to anymore. Jonathan listened like a man watching the final scenes of a film he didn't want to end. And still, he didn't tell her. That night, he found himself back in his penthouse, glass walls, cold marble floors, a wine fridge full of bottles he no longer cared to drink. Malik had driven him back quietly, glancing in the mirror more than once as if trying to figure out who this slower, quieter version of Jonathan was. He opened a drawer in his bedroom and pulled out the scan. The tumor stared back at him like a clock with no numbers. Just a circle, a void, growing slowly in the center of his body. He shut the drawer. The next morning, Eliza texted first. Eliza. You ever go to Coney Island in the off-season? Jonathan. Once. For a fundraiser. Eliza. Wrong answer. Come on. I'll show you the real one. And she did. The boardwalk was half empty, the air sharp with sea salt and silence. She brought a disposable camera, took his photo next to an old roller coaster, and called him. Stoic with a side of haunted. They ate greasy fries out of a paper bag and argued over which decade had the best music. She insisted it was the 90s. He said the 70s. She called him old. He called her nostalgic for things she never lived through. They stayed until the sky turned violet and the street lamps flickered on. You always like this? She asked suddenly, sitting on the edge of the wooden railing. Like what? Polite. Gentle. Like you're trying to freeze time. Jonathan swallowed. No. I think I'm just learning. Eliza studied him for a moment. From what? He looked out at the ocean. From someone who doesn't know how to waste time anymore. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt something that might have been hope, or at least the shape of it. That night he didn't go home. They ended up in her apartment, lying side by side on her mattress on the floor, surrounded by books, sketches, and a space heater that coughed more than it warmed. He didn't touch her. He just watched her sleep. He wanted to tell her. God, he almost did. But the words never came. Instead, he whispered into the darkness, barely audible. I'm not ready to leave. She stirred, half dreaming, and replied without opening her eyes. Then don't. And he lay there, still and silent, as if that choice could be made just by wanting it. Jonathan had always measured life in metrics, return on equity, profit margins, minutes between meetings. But now, He found himself counting in quieter units. The way Eliza's hand curled instinctively toward her pencil while she spoke, the way the sunlight fell across her cheekbones as she sketched without noticing, the warmth of her laughter cutting through his thoughts when he wasn't expecting it. He had 12 days left, give or take. That's what the doctor had said yesterday in a voice so carefully neutral it felt like someone else's diagnosis. 12 days. He hadn't told Eliza. The days they spent together passed with a rhythm that didn't feel borrowed. Eliza treated time with a kind of reckless tenderness. She had no plans, and that made her dangerous, for a man like Jonathan, who had scheduled his entire existence into color-coded slots. She made him late. On purpose. To him, it was chaos. To her, it was art. They rode the Staten Island ferry one morning, just to feel the wind in their faces. He bought her a pretzel that tasted like cardboard, and she made him eat it anyway, saying it was part of the experience. That night they wandered through Washington Square, where a cellist played Bach under the archway, and Eliza danced barefoot in the plaza fountain, pretending not to care when strangers stared. Jonathan had never felt more alive. And never more haunted. She was starting to ask questions. "Why haven't I seen where you live?" she asked one afternoon as they sat on the floor of her apartment, surrounded by half-finished drawings and records that didn't quite match their sleeves. He offered a vague smile. "It's not that interesting." Eliza gave him a long look. "You lie badly." He paused, pretending to rearrange the records. "Let's just say it's a place I don't go to feel anything." She didn't press. But something in her expression shifted. A subtle lean back. A hesitation. The first hint of distance. That evening, they took a train up to Cold Spring on a whim. She wanted to draw the river at sunset, and he was too afraid to say no. As she sketched, seated on a slope of cold stone, he watched her with a kind of desperate reverence. He knew he was stealing time from her, and that every silence between them was growing louder. That night, back in the city, he walked her home and stood outside her door, heart pounding. He could feel the moment coming. "Jonathan," she said, not meeting his eyes. "You're hiding something." He nodded, slowly. She looked up then, gaze steady, mouth set in a line that wasn't angry, but wasn't soft either. "Is it another woman?" "No," he said, voice thin. "Then what?" "I'll tell you soon." "You said that yesterday," she replied. Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was tired. She stepped back into the doorway. "Good night, Jonathan." He didn't follow. He couldn't. That night he stood at his penthouse window again, looking down at the city like a man floating above his own life. He took the bottle of pills from the drawer, prescribed to manage the symptoms that were creeping faster now, and held them in his hand without opening the cap. He couldn't feel his left fingertips anymore. The numbness had spread. His appetite was fading. His skin was gray in the mirror, but Eliza hadn't noticed. Or maybe she had. He called his doctor, asked questions he already knew the answers to. 2 weeks, she repeated gently. If that. He didn't sleep. The next day, he waited outside the cafe where she worked, watching her through the window as she moved behind the counter, sleeves pushed up, a pencil tucked behind one ear. She hadn't responded to his text. He was just about to leave when someone approached her at the counter, a girl, no older than 19. Eliza smiled, took a small notebook from her bag, signed it. The girl grinned, said something, and Eliza laughed in return. Jonathan stood frozen. He didn't know she had fans. He didn't know she was already becoming something bigger than the life she lived. A small following, maybe. But enough to suggest she was on the cusp of something, and he was only beginning to understand who she was. That night she didn't return his calls. On the 4th attempt, he left a voicemail. Eliza. I need to see you. There's something I should have said earlier. Something I should have told you the first day we met. He hung up. Then he sat on the edge of the couch until dawn, waiting for a call that never came. It wasn't until late the next afternoon that she finally appeared, at his building. He opened the door to find her standing there, windblown and silent, her sketchbook clutched in one hand. This your place? she asked. He nodded, suddenly aware of the sterile elegance behind him. Glass, stone, a view that cost more than most lives. I had to Google you, she said, stepping past him before he could answer. She walked through the penthouse slowly, as if cataloging the contradictions. Her eyes settled on a framed photo near the fireplace. Jonathan with the mayor at a ribbon cutting, another life ago. You lied to me? Yes, he said quietly. She turned. Are you married? No. Then what is it? Jonathan opened his mouth. Closed it again. Then finally, I'm dying. The words dropped between them like a pane of glass shattering. Eliza said nothing. Not at first. Then she walked over to the nearest window and stood there, her breath fogging the glass. How long? 10 days, maybe. She turned, eyes wet but unreadable. And what were you going to do? Just disappear? He shook his head, helpless. I didn't want pity. Or panic. I just wanted 1 month. To feel something real. And you thought using me for that was okay? I didn't use you, he said. I found you. The silence stretched long. Finally, Eliza picked up her sketchbook, held it out to him. Inside was a drawing, him, sitting at the fountain in Washington Square, laughing. I drew this 3 days after we met. You didn't know I was sketching. You looked happy. And I thought, there's something broken in this man, but he wants to feel whole. She stepped back. I just didn't know how much was breaking. Jonathan reached for her hand, but she pulled away. I need time, she said, her voice trembling, to figure out if this was something real. Or just something dying. And then she left, leaving the sketchbook behind, and Jonathan alone with the weight of everything he had finally told the truth about. Jonathan did not move for hours after Eliza left. The penthouse, once a symbol of triumph, now felt like a mausoleum. The air was too still, the silence too loud. Her sketchbook lay open on the coffee table, a fragile remnant of something that had felt real, until truth broke its surface. He wanted to call her. To say more. To explain that he had chosen silence not out of cowardice, but because for the first time in his life, he had feared the loss of something he hadn't even allowed himself to fully claim. But Eliza had asked for time. And he would give it. That night, the pain in his side returned, sharper than before. He refused to take the stronger medication. He needed his mind intact. If these were his final days, they would not pass in a fog. The next morning, Malik drove him to the West Side piers. No destination. Jonathan just wanted movement. He walked slowly along the water, pausing every few blocks. Breathing was heavier now. Fatigue came quickly. At one point he sat on a bench and dozed without meaning to. When he opened his eyes, an old man nearby was feeding pigeons from a paper bag. They come back even if you scare them, the man said without looking up. Jonathan nodded. I know the feeling. When he returned home that evening, the sketchbook was still on the table. He picked it up, flipping through its pages again. Some were quick pencil gestures, moments captured in seconds. Others had been labored over. A ferry boat, their table at the cafe, a quiet portrait of his face he didn't know she had drawn. She'd shaded his jaw with a softness he didn't recognize in himself. The next day, he went to her. The cafe was crowded. Rain tapped against the window panes like an impatient guest. He stood outside in his coat, watching through the glass. Eliza moved behind the counter, hair pinned back, sleeves rolled high. She hadn't seen him yet. He stepped inside. She noticed him immediately. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither moved. Then she nodded, barely, and gestured to wait. After the rush thinned, she came around the counter, wiping her hands on a towel. You shouldn't be on your feet, she said, not unkindly. I had to see you. She looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. Come with me. They walked in silence through the back, into the alley behind the building, where cigarette butts lined the curb and steam curled up from a grate. It was damp and ugly, but they were alone. I'm angry, she said. I know. I don't know who I'm angry at. You. Myself? Maybe both. He didn't speak. I wanted to hate you. She continued, voice steadier. But then I remembered how you looked at things. Like you were trying to memorize them. Like you knew they were going to be taken away. I was, he said softly. She rubbed her arms, her breath visible in the cold. So what now? Are you just waiting to die? No, he said. I'm waiting for you to tell me if you still want to be part of whatever time I have left. She turned toward him, slowly. I don't want to say goodbye every time we see each other. I don't want that either. But we might have to. I'd rather say goodbye 1,000 times than not see you once. That broke something in her. Her shoulders slackened. She stepped forward and leaned into him, resting her forehead against his chest. You make everything complicated, she whispered. I was always like this, he murmured, holding her gently. You're just the first person I let see it. They stood like that for a long time. Later, back in her apartment, he watched her work on a new piece, an abstract mix of charcoal and watercolors, shapes bleeding into one another like thoughts overlapping. He sat on the floor beside her desk, sipping tea she insisted on brewing despite the hour. What's it called? He asked. I don't name them until they're done, she said without looking up. Smart. A beat passed. I'm scared, she added. Of me dying? Of what happens to me if you do? He reached out, touched her wrist. Eliza, you existed long before I showed up. And you'll exist long after. That's the problem, she said. I like not thinking about time. Me too. For the next few days she stayed close. She brought her sketching materials to his penthouse, filling the sterile space with life. They read together, sometimes in silence, sometimes aloud. She insisted on dragging him to a rooftop garden in Brooklyn because, as she put it, if we're running out of days, we might as well waste a few of them well. Jonathan felt himself changing. Not in some cinematic redemption arc. Not from broken to whole. But from armored to raw. He cried one morning, without warning, when she handed him a mug of coffee and said nothing but, "Hey!" He cried again the night they made love, not because it was perfect, but because it was flawed and real and entirely undeserved. Each day, he waited for the end. And each day, it didn't come. Until the pain stopped. He didn't notice at first. It was subtle. Then a week passed. Then 2. He returned to the hospital, alone. Dr. Lenehan stared at the new scan like it was a puzzle missing its edge. It's shrinking, she said slowly. What? The tumor. It's regressing. Drastically. That's not possible. It's not common, she admitted. But it's happening. I need to run more tests. But Jonathan, you may live. He walked home in a daze, unsure if he should feel grateful or betrayed. He'd mourned his life. Let go of it. What did it mean now to return? Eliza opened the door before he could knock. She saw his face, and for a moment she looked terrified. What is it? She asked. I'm not dying, he said. She blinked. Say that again. I'm not dying. The silence between them felt infinite. Then she stepped back, slowly, eyes full. You better not waste this. I won't. She pulled him inside, and for the first time, they didn't rush toward or away from anything. They just stood there, breathing. Together. Jonathan didn't sleep that night. He lay in Eliza's bed, listening to her steady breathing, eyes fixed on the ceiling, and felt the weight of a truth more complex than death, what it meant to keep living. He had spent weeks preparing for the end, shedding layers of control, fear, and vanity. He had stared down mortality, looked into its hollow mouth, and found meaning where he had least expected it, in a quiet apartment above a coffee shop, in a girl who didn't care about money, in drawings that captured him more honestly than any photograph ever had. And now, the path he had resigned himself to was gone. The sentence lifted. But so too, it seemed, was the clarity that came with its presence. The following morning, Eliza stirred, blinked into the sunlight, and turned toward him. You were awake all night, she said groggily. I didn't want to miss anything. he replied. She reached out and placed a hand on his chest. You don't have to live like you're dying anymore. That's the thing, he said. I don't know how to live like anything else. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her. Do you want to go back? To the way things were before? No, he said quickly. But I'm afraid that I might. Eliza studied him carefully, as if sketching with her eyes. Then don't. It's not that simple. It is, she said softly. It has to be. He returned to the penthouse that afternoon, not because he wanted to, but because a part of him needed to see what he had left behind. The place was just as he remembered. Polished, cold, untouched. His assistant had maintained everything. Emails were still arriving. Investors still asked questions. The world hadn't paused. He stood in the center of his home and whispered, I don't know who I am here anymore. The phone rang. He ignored it. That evening, he returned to Eliza. She was on the roof of her building, sketching the skyline with charcoal smudges on her fingers and knees drawn to her chest. Draw me, he said. She raised an eyebrow. You hate sitting still. I'm not going anywhere, he replied. She drew him in silence. It was an unfinished sketch, rough, impatient lines, incomplete contours, but it was honest. He looked down at it when she finished and saw himself not as the man who'd been dying, not as the man who'd once ruled boardrooms, but as someone beginning again. Later that week, he quietly transferred ownership of his penthouse to a housing nonprofit. Donated the art. Liquidated the cars. No announcements. No media. Just signatures and silence. He moved into Eliza's apartment. The mattress stayed on the floor. One morning, as they sat drinking burnt coffee she insisted on brewing herself, she asked, So what's next for you? He looked at her. You. She smiled, a little sad, as if she knew that even the purest beginnings carry their own shadows. You sure? She asked. No, he said. But I want to be. Outside, the city kept moving. Horns, voices, footsteps, the chaos of a place that didn't stop for anyone. But inside their quiet corner of the world, time bent slightly. He hadn't died. But something had. And in its place, something new was still learning to breathe. Surviving, Jonathan discovered, was its own kind of burden. In the days following the doctor's call, he found himself caught between two selves, the man he'd been before the diagnosis, and the man he thought he'd become when he believed he had only weeks to live. Neither felt entirely real anymore. People around him wanted answers. His assistant called twice daily, politely asking if he planned to return to the firm. His board sent carefully worded inquiries about his health. Some tabloids had caught wind of his mysterious absence, and speculation brewed, rehab, breakdown, secret affair. He ignored them all. He stayed in Eliza's apartment, though her mattress bruised his back and her faucet leaked at night. He kept forgetting there was no dishwasher. The fridge was always half empty, stocked with almond milk, leftovers, and little else. But he didn't leave. Not because he couldn't. Because for the first time, he had no excuse to. Eliza never asked what he planned to do now. She just lived. Each morning, she sketched at the kitchen table with her headphones in. Afternoons were reserved for cafe shifts and walks through the city. Sometimes she'd come home with ink on her fingers and ideas she couldn't stop talking about. Other times she'd say nothing at all, curling beside him in silence. He watched her live. Freely. Unstructured. Purposeful in her purposelessness. And he felt slow. Not in body but in spirit. One night he asked her, Do you think it matters that I don't know what to do anymore? She looked up from her sketchbook. It only matters if you start pretending again. I'm not. You're thinking about it, she said, brushing graphite dust from the page. He exhaled, leaning back against the wall. I don't know who I am if I'm not chasing something. Eliza nodded. Then maybe you need to stop chasing. Let it come to you. He scoffed. That's not how my world works. Then maybe it's time you found a different world. The next morning, he sold his remaining shares in the firm. Quietly. Cleanly. No announcement. No press. He met with his lawyer the same day and signed documents dissolving the trust funds tied to corporate assets. Instead, he directed the money towards something Eliza had once mentioned in passing, a studio collective for artists priced out of the city. "You remember that?" she asked when he told her. "I remember everything you say," he replied. She smiled. "You're getting soft. I was always soft. I just covered it well." That night they sat on the fire escape with 2 cups of terrible wine and a view of nothing in particular. Jonathan asked, "If I hadn't gotten sick, do you think this would have happened?" Eliza tilted her head. "No." He nodded. "Me either. But I'm glad it did," she added. "Even if it came with all that pain. You make it bearable." She took his hand, and for a while they said nothing more. Jonathan still woke up some nights in a sweat, heart pounding, convinced the tumor had returned. Sometimes he caught his reflection in the mirror and expected to see a man with weeks to live. The ghost of that deadline hadn't vanished. It just faded, slower than he liked. But Eliza never treated him like a miracle. She didn't let him fall back into performance. If he grew restless, she handed him a brush. If he got quiet, she let him be. And when he admitted he was terrified that he no longer mattered to the world, she kissed him once and said, "Matter to yourself first. Then we'll talk." So he tried. He took walks without a destination. Learned to cook one bad pasta recipe, and refused to improve it. Started reading fiction. Wrote small essays he didn't show anyone. He made no announcements. He just lived. Not loudly. Not perfectly. But fully. And for the first time in decades, that was enough. Spring slid quietly into summer, and the urgency that had once clung to every hour began to dissolve. The fear had receded, not gone, not forgotten, but dulled, like a wound no longer fresh. Jonathan still counted the days, but not like a man bracing for the end. Now he counted to remember. He and Eliza settled into something that wasn't quite routine, but had rhythm. They woke when they woke. Ate what they could cook. She worked shifts at the cafe and disappeared into sketchbooks for hours at a time. He stayed mostly close, still reluctant to let the city pull him back into its machinery. But the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the quiet of uncertainty. It was the quiet of knowing. One morning, while she sketched on the fire escape and he drank instant coffee from a chipped mug, she said without looking up, "You should be doing something." He looked at her. "I thought we agreed I didn't need to be useful." She smirked. "Not for me. For you." Jonathan stared at the skyline. He still had money. Not obscene wealth anymore, but enough. Enough to live, enough to choose. Enough to start. "What if I don't know what that is?" he asked. "Then try everything until something doesn't feel like trying." The next day, he walked into a small bookstore in the East Village and spent 2 hours talking to the owner about publishing, paper textures, and the dying art of letterpress. The day after, he sat in a park with a journal and tried to write down how it felt to almost die and then not. It didn't come out clean. But it came out. He started going back to places he'd avoided, galleries, museums, street fairs, trying to feel something that wasn't measured in profit. And every night, he returned to Eliza. She didn't ask him to define anything. Not their relationship, not his days, not his progress. But he could feel her watching, waiting, not with expectation, but with care. One humid evening, as thunder rolled faintly in the distance, she turned to him in bed and asked, "Are you in love with me?" He didn't answer right away. "Yes," he said. "But I didn't want to say it until I meant it for the version of me that lives. Not the one who thought he was dying." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay. Okay? I've been waiting to see who you'd be when you stopped looking over your shoulder. And? You're slower. Softer. Less scared." He smiled faintly. "That a good thing?" "It's the best thing." They lay in silence, the fan humming in the corner, the storm teasing the edge of the sky. I love you too, she said eventually, like a secret she'd been holding in the folds of her breath. He exhaled. Not relief. Not victory. Something gentler. Something real. The story wasn't about dying anymore. It was about living, without spectacle, without legacy, without timelines. Just living. With her. The thing about building a life after survival is no one tells you how quiet it can be. There were no parades, no cinematic turns. Just the slow unfolding of ordinary days, mornings with oversteeped tea, evenings marked by Eliza's socks left in the laundry, Jonathan burning toast for the third time. The pace of it all felt unfamiliar to him. He had spent so many years outrunning silence that when it finally sat down beside him, it took effort not to flinch. But Eliza made it easier. One late July morning, they visited a used furniture shop in Red Hook. Eliza wanted a real table, one with legs that didn't wobble and enough space to work without using the floor. Jonathan found himself haggling with a man in overalls over a worn oak piece with a deep scratch down the middle. It's imperfect, the seller had said, with a shrug. Jonathan smiled. So am I. They carried it home themselves, up 3 flights of stairs, sweating and laughing, both too proud to ask for help. The scratch became part of their living space, a line through the wood that caught light in the late afternoon like a reminder that some flaws don't need fixing. That night, seated at their new table, Eliza said, I think you should talk to someone. He raised an eyebrow. I talk to you. She pushed a plate of pasta toward him. You perform for me. You don't talk. He didn't argue. She wasn't wrong. 2 weeks later, he started seeing a therapist. Her office was in a walk-up over a florist's shop, and she had kind eyes that didn't flinch when he told her about the tumor, the prognosis, the not dying. You mourned your own death, she said. And now you're grieving a version of yourself that never came. That stayed with him. On the walk home, through crowded streets and honking cabs, he wondered how many people were doing the same, living after endings, quietly rearranging their lives in the shadows of stories no one else saw. Back in the apartment, Eliza was at the table, editing a spread for her graphic novel. She'd signed with a small publisher 2 weeks earlier, quietly, almost reluctantly, and now deadlines were creeping into their evenings. Jonathan watched her, the way she chewed her lip when thinking, the way she tapped the pencil 3 times before starting a new page. He loved her more in the mundane than he ever had in the magic. But the fear hadn't vanished. Sometimes he'd wake at 3 a.m., half sure the pain would return. That his reprieve was temporary. That life would snatch itself back like an afterthought. One night, unable to sleep, he sat on the fire escape and smoked a cigarette he didn't want. Eliza found him there, barefoot, hair messy, her shirt hanging off one shoulder. You don't even smoke, she said, settling beside him. I think I just wanted to hold something burning. She rested her head on his shoulder. You're still waiting for it to happen again. He nodded. Maybe it will, she said. But maybe it won't. That uncertainty used to drive me. Now it just unravels me. You're allowed to be afraid, she said. Just don't let it make your choices for you. He turned to her. What if I'm still learning how to live without the chase? Then keep learning, she said. But do it here. With me. He kissed her then, slow and grateful, and dropped the cigarette into the alley below. In early August, Jonathan took a job, not in finance, not in management. He volunteered at a non-profit downtown that offered financial literacy workshops for young adults aging out of the foster system. He taught them how to read loan terms, how to budget without shame, how to spot a trap disguised as opportunity. You used to do this for billion-dollar deals? One kid asked him. He smiled. Yeah. And it was never this satisfying. He came home each day with stories, exhaustion, and a kind of clarity he never found on the 48th floor of his former life. Eliza kept drawing. Her novel was nearly done. Sometimes she'd read him lines from it, moments her characters broke or mended or learned how to stand still. He recognized them. Not the stories, but the emotions. He'd lived inside every one. One night she put down her pencil mid-sketch and said, "I want to move somewhere with trees." He looked up from his book. "Trees? Yeah. Not forever. Just for a bit. I want to see seasons happen slower." He closed the book. "Where? I don't know. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere we can plant something." "You're nesting," he teased. She shrugged. "I want to know what it feels like to stay still on purpose." So did he. And just like that, the question of what now shifted again. It wasn't about fixing the past or outrunning regret. It wasn't about pretending everything had meaning. It was about small, deliberate choices. About picking the life you could wake up in and not need to escape. Jonathan was still afraid. He still thought about hospitals, about timelines, about the tumor that once threatened everything. But now, he let those thoughts pass through him like weather, acknowledged, but no longer obeyed. He had survived. And now, slowly, imperfectly, he was learning to belong. Not to legacy. Not to ambition. But to someone. To somewhere. To the ordinary beauty of staying. By September, the leaves had begun to turn on the few trees scattered through the city, those stubborn, grimy survivors growing between sidewalk cracks and in narrow medians. Eliza called them the brave ones. Jonathan just saw them as reminders that growth could happen anywhere, even when the soil was bad and the odds were worse. They signed the lease on a cottage 2 hours north of Manhattan. It was small, barely 2 bedrooms, creaky floors, a kitchen that smelled faintly of cedar and old soap. But it had what they wanted: trees, light, and a silence that felt like an invitation rather than an absence. There was a porch where Eliza said she'd paint. A spare room Jonathan quietly planned to turn into a writing space, though he hadn't admitted that out loud yet. Moving day was clumsy. Boxes got mislabeled. The rental van nearly backed into a mailbox. But as they unloaded mismatched mugs, old sketchbooks, and the scratch table they refused to leave behind, Jonathan felt something steady settle in his chest. It wasn't happiness, exactly. It was something deeper. The first night there, they sat outside in folding chairs, wrapped in blankets, watching the sky slip from blue to slate to black. Crickets buzzed in the trees. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor's dog barked once and then went quiet. "I keep expecting a car horn," Eliza said, sipping tea. Jonathan smiled. "I keep expecting a meeting reminder." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You think we'll get used to this?" "I hope not," he said. The next few weeks became a slow, careful rhythm. Eliza painted during the mornings, light pouring through the windows, bare feet smudged with dust. Her publisher sent back edits and deadlines, but she met them calmly, one at a time. Sometimes she'd call Jonathan into her studio to ask, "Does this color feel right?" Or, "Do you think this panel says enough without saying it?" He always answered honestly. She never flinched. Jonathan spent his time trying to write, not about cancer, not about dying, but about what came after. He wasn't sure what shape it would take. Memoir? Essay? Something fictional, perhaps. What mattered more than form was voice, and for the first time in his life, he wanted it to sound like him. Not the curated man from magazine profiles. Just him. He volunteered at the local library twice a week, helping seniors set up email accounts and teens edit college essays. It was quiet work, deeply unglamorous, and it grounded him more than any speech he'd ever given from a podium. One afternoon, he found Eliza in the backyard, crouched beside a patch of earth she'd cleared near the fence. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Trying to plant something," she said, wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Not sure what yet." He looked down at the soil, clumpy, dry, reluctant. "Hard ground," he murmured. "Yeah," she said. "But that just means it's been waiting." They bought seeds the next day. Tomatoes. Basil. Lavender. They spent a weekend digging and watering and arguing about spacing. They planted anyway. And for once, Jonathan didn't try to control the outcome. He just watched. In early October, during an overnight trip back to the city to finalize the last of his corporate divestments, Jonathan had dinner with his former lawyer, Henry. "You seem different," Henry said over steak and half-drunk wine. Jonathan considered the comment. "I think I am," he said. "You're done, then? No more firm? No projects waiting in the wings?" "No," Jonathan said, smiling. "I'm not building an empire this time. Just a life." Henry leaned back, studying him like a stranger he hadn't met before. "And you're happy with that?" "I'm learning to be." That night, as the train carried him back north, Jonathan looked out the window and thought of Eliza's hands in the dirt, the way she marked time not with clocks but with color. He thought of the small life they were creating, and how much larger it felt than anything he'd ever owned. Back home, the lights were on in the kitchen. Eliza stood barefoot at the sink, humming along to some half-forgotten melody. A candle flickered beside her. She looked up as he entered, smiled, and said, "You smell like train grease." He kissed her anyway. Later, curled together under the weight of their mismatched quilts, Eliza whispered, "Do you still think about it? The cancer?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes," he said. "Not every day. But it's there. Like a shadow I don't walk through anymore, just walk beside." She reached for his hand beneath the covers. "And the version of your life that could have ended?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think about how close I came to never meeting you properly. To never sitting in this house. To never getting a second chance and actually using it. Do you ever miss who you were before?" "No," he said softly. "But sometimes I miss how easy it was to avoid myself." Eliza smiled into the dark. "Avoiding yourself isn't living, Jonathan. It's hiding." "I know," he said. "That's why I stayed." Outside, the trees swayed in the wind, branches whispering across the roof like a reminder. Of growth. Of time. Of how little we really need when we stop pretending we need everything. The house was quiet. Their lives were small. But they were real. And that was enough. Winter crept in without permission. The first frost came early, coating the garden bed with a fragile white that glittered at sunrise and melted by noon. The lavender wilted. The tomatoes gave up quietly. Only the basil held on, stubborn and green until the last possible day. Jonathan stood at the window that morning, coffee in hand, watching steam curl up from the mug like breath. Eliza was still asleep, one arm thrown across his side of the bed, tangled in their worn sheets. He had begun to measure time differently. Not in days or weeks. Not since the diagnosis had turned backward on itself, and left him standing on a road he thought had ended. Now he measured time by the things that lasted. The curve of Eliza's smile in the morning light. The warmth of her body beside his when she dreamt restlessly. The way her sketchbooks filled slowly, no two lines ever repeating. The stillness in himself when he no longer feared endings. The book he'd been writing, a collection of fragments, memories, essays stitched together without tidy borders, was nearly finished. He didn't call it a memoir. That word still felt too vain. Too final. But the title had come to him one day while watching Eliza press a dried basil leaf into a notebook. The life left to live. Not dramatic. Not heroic. Just true. He hadn't told her he planned to publish it. Not yet. Not because it was a secret, but because it still felt like it belonged to both of them. Every page held echoes of their days. The first train ride north, the chipped coffee mugs, the silence of nights spent trying not to break apart. Later that week, they went into town to buy salt for the driveway and a new bulb for the porch light. The store owner, a woman in her 70s with windburned cheeks and a plaid scarf, recognized Jonathan from the library. "You're the one who helps the kids with their essays," she said, handing him change. "You know, people remember things like that. Not who you were. What you do now." He nodded, pocketing the coins. "That's what I'm hoping." Eliza was waiting outside with a bag of tea she didn't need and a grin she couldn't explain. "You bought rooibos again," he said, teasing. "I like the name," she replied. "Sounds like someone who fixes bicycles in a children's book." He laughed. Loudly. The kind of laugh that caught in his chest and stayed there. Back home, they lit the fire and cooked slowly. Eliza burned the onions. Jonathan undercooked the rice. Neither cared. They ate cross-legged on the floor because the new chairs hadn't arrived, drinking too hot tea and watching smoke curl into the rafters. Later that night, she asked, "Do you ever think about the fact that we weren't supposed to be here?" "All the time," he said. "And what do you think now?" "I think the universe doesn't care about what's supposed to happen. Just about what we do when it doesn't." She traced the outline of his knuckles with her thumb. "Promise me something?" "Anything. If it comes back, if the cancer returns, don't shut me out." "I won't," he said. And he meant it. "And if it doesn't? Then I'll grow old here. With you. Watching Basil die and grow back. Reading the same books twice. Forgetting where I put the mugs." She smiled into the darkness. "That sounds like a good life." "It is." Spring would come again. He didn't need it to rush. He didn't fear what came next. There were no more bets to win, no more empires to build. Just mornings and evenings and all the hours in between that didn't need to be profound, only shared. He had come close to death, and it had taught him something most people never learn until it's too late. The quiet life, if chosen freely, is not a compromise. It is a triumph. And in the last light of that winter night, with the fire crackling low and her hand still resting in his, Jonathan Miles, once a man of numbers and power, let go of all that had been. And lived.